Good morning. Trust those that are with us. It's a good day for you. We'll be starting a new study today. We finished up the book of John on Wednesday night, and so we'll begin a study of Leviticus here this morning. And so if you want to be turning to that book, I don't know how far we'll get into the actual book today, but we'll start introducing this book in the 30 minutes that we have available. Before we do that, let's go to God in prayer. Our God and Father in heaven, we are thankful for the day you have given us, this time now, Father, that we have to open your word and study from it. We ask as we look at those things you have revealed that we will find the guidance, the strength, and the comfort that come from you in them, that we might be right and pleasing in your sight, that we will have the opportunity to correct that which may fall short. Father, we ask continued blessings on this world and especially those afflicted by this virus. We ask, Father, that if it can be put away and we return to our normalcy, and that those that have it might be healed if it be your will. We ask all these things through your Son, who gave his life that we might have that hope of eternal life. Amen. The book of Leviticus, it's one of those Old Testament books. Quite often, it is one that has not been studied, not been looked at closely. If you think about even when we make that resolution at the beginning of the year that, I'm going to study through the Bible or read through the Bible this year, and we get Genesis and we do fairly well. We get slowed down at chapters 10 and 11 when we get all those names of people, and we let that get in our way instead of understanding God wanted us to know about them. Then we get to Exodus and we find out about the children being in bondage and Moses coming to lead them out. We get to Leviticus and it starts into all these laws about all these sacrifices and how we have to go. By the time we get to Book of Numbers and we get that listing of genealogies again, most of the time we've given up on trying to read through. I'm going to encourage you as we begin to study Leviticus, and the next book we'll study after Leviticus will be Hebrews, because it's the New Testament partner, shall we say. These two books work together and show a lot to the Christian. But I want to encourage you, Leviticus is only 27 chapters, 40-something pages in length. People say, 27 chapters. Each chapter is about a page. Read 4 or 5 pages a night. Think about that. In 10 days, you will have read the book of Leviticus all the way through. But begin reading this book and read it from the perspective of, yes, it's historical and it's the things that were told to them in that day, but also read it with it being the type, the foreshadowing of what the New Testament will be about, as we're going to look at here in a moment, a little bit of that idea. Leviticus then, from the start of the book all the way to its end, has the purpose of showing the child of God the importance of worship, holiness, and atonement. For the Israelite, it was the direct law of worship then. For us now, it is the example of that worship. For them, it was the specification of how to be holy or sanctified, set apart to God. For us, it is the example of what they did that we can use to set forth what we ought to do. And in the atonement or the covering, there was a price that had to be paid. And we're going to see that throughout this book, this idea of atonement. In fact, for a moment, thinking about it, when we look back, and we'll give some more on this in a moment, but the book of Exodus, we'll just take Exodus because Leviticus is the natural progression from Exodus. Exodus is a book where God got his people out of Egypt. Leviticus is now the book where we get Egypt out of his people. And think about that in the Christian, the gospel, those first 4 books we often call the Gospels, but the gospel that we see preached in those books and in the beginning of Acts is that which gets the Christian out of the world, What are the epistles about? The rest of that New Testament, it's about getting the world out of the Christian. We have to do the same thing. And so when we think about these books, we'll see how it strives to get the world out of the Christian, just as God is having to strive to get Egypt out of his people. 5 important words as we look at Leviticus and going through. 5 important words. The first word, sin. Sin, the effect of the world on God's people. Sin is doing that which God has said not to do, or not doing that which God has said to do, doing something that violates one's conscience. Sin separates man from God. And so we see the effect of the world on God's people with this word. The implication, in fact, sin, 300 times that word is used in Leviticus. The implication of that, sin is something that God is concerned about. God has much to say on it. A second important word in Leviticus, atonement. Atonement. Without which man has no hope. If man has no atonement, no covering, no price paid for his sin, man has no hope. A word speaking towards this idea of atonement or the reconciliation of God and man are found 170 plus times in Leviticus. It must be important. In fact, it's important to note that words that lead to atonement or reconciliation. Here are words that are used some 560 plus times in Leviticus. The numbers here alone should make it abundantly clear. There is something man must do to be reconciled with God. If we think about this, and we'll hear it, and I want us to just keep that thought in our mind, while this is going to be about very physical worship on the earth, think about the same picture. What did the children of Israel do to get themselves out of Egypt? Have you ever thought that? They didn't do one plague. They didn't do one miracle. They didn't do anything except for obey God. When God said, for example, on the 10th plague, you put blood, the blood of a lamb on both door sides and on the top. And if they did it, the angel of death passed over, there's where the term Passover comes from, passed over their dwelling. If they failed to obey God. Now, did they do anything? Did they go out and kill those firstborn? They didn't do anything except for put that blood as God had specified, and then God passed over their houses on that night. And so we see this idea. There is something man must do to be reconciled to God. When we get into Leviticus and we begin to look at the sacrifices, and then when we study Hebrews, we're going to find out those sacrifices couldn't stand in the place of a man. No beast, no animal of any kind has ever been equivalent to man in terms of value. And so the killing of a lamb or a bull or a goat, while it stood as a substitutionary sacrifice, as we're going to see, could not be the atonement, couldn't be the final payment as it's pointing forward. And the idea then that man had to bring something, had to sacrifice it, had to give that atonement. There was something man had to do. It took God to forgive man, but it took man to make access to that forgiveness. And so we see the idea of atonement. Holiness, the third word. So the third of the 5 words, we've had sin, atonement, holiness. Holiness, the state of being in fellowship with or separated for service unto God. Key thought of Leviticus is found in Leviticus 19:2, and it's quoted into the New Testament. You'll recognize it when it says, "Be ye holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." The whole idea of holiness, being set apart. Leviticus is going to show that crucial concept of being holy, used 94 times in the book. And it gives us then the indication to us of God's desire for his people to remove the world from themselves. Remember that thought. In Exodus, God got them out of Egypt. Here in Leviticus, he's got to get Egypt out of them. When we think about it from the Christian perspective, and Hebrews will help explain this when we get to it after Leviticus, but we as Christians, God, through the plan of salvation, gets us out of the world, but have we gotten the world out of us? And that's where this goes. The fourth word, worship. Here is, if you wanted to put a one-word purpose to Leviticus, this is the one word, worship. That's the entire purpose. We'll talk about the title and how many think, oh, it's only pertaining to the priest here in a few moments, and see that it's much more broad, much more general than that. It is pertaining to the priest, but the priest had a specific role to play for worshiping God. New Testament, we're going to see that all change in a way. So worship. And so we have that picture of worship. Christians today, as we look at Leviticus, we need to remember we are now God's priest. If we go over to 1 Peter 2:5 and verse 9 also, in Revelation 1:6, we know that every Christian today is a priest. Anybody that teaches different is teaching something that is invalid according to the scriptures. So as priests, the book of Leviticus then, a book about the Levitical priesthood and its function, ought to be then important as something of an example. In fact, think of Romans 15:4. When you go to study Leviticus and as you read it, if you want a starting point every night, read Romans 15:4 before you begin reading the book of Leviticus, whatever section you're reading of it. Romans 15:4 says, "For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the scriptures might have hope." Do we read Leviticus with that idea of learning about the worship? While in Leviticus, yes, they had a physical vesture and they offered physical animals and sacrifices at that time. We have a responsibility now as priests in that New Testament covenant. We should study the types that are found in Leviticus. We're not going to begin doing animal sacrifices. That's not what God calls for now. But they stand as a type and as a picture for us. And so we ought to study those in light of Hebrews as we're going to go into after Leviticus. We need to understand the blood of animal sacrifices is a type for the final offering of the blood of Christ. That the washing in the laver before entering the holy place is a type of baptism, through which one enters the church, that holy place. We need to understand the holy place itself is a type of the church. We're going to discuss some more of that in just a moment. Basically, we need to understand there was a pattern for worship then. And so there is a pattern for worship now. When God in chapter 10 of Leviticus killed 2 priests, because they violated the pattern of worship, they brought strange fire. So it ought to give us a warning today that if we change God's pattern of worship, we stand in the same place. And then the fifth and final word, and we'll list all 5 of them here in a moment again, priest. Priest. We've already given the description, but Christians are described within the New Testament as priests, 1 Peter 2:5 and 9. And so the types for the priest, looking back at what the priest's responsibility, what the priest was to do, nearly innumerable. You think about it, and we began a discussion under worship, but think about this. You start with the entire complex of the tabernacle that was built in the book of Exodus. There's another picture. In Exodus, when we came out of the world, God built the tabernacle. In Leviticus, we worship in the tabernacle. And so we see this very picture. You can start with that entire complex, with the courtyard, as Hebrews describes, as being the world, with the altar being the type of Christ's sacrifice on the cross, where that blood offering was made. The laver being a type of baptism, washing oneself. Sounded a little bit like Paul before entering into the holy place. It is a type of the church with the Holy of Holies, that place that you could only get to by going through the holy place to the Holy of Holies, which is heaven itself. You could go on, and we're not going to try to do that this morning, but to the type that's found within the lampstand, within the altar of incense, within the table of showbread, and on and on and on. And so we see this picture of the physical priesthood and its activities and how it stands to help us to understand our role as spiritual priests today. And so we look at the book of Leviticus in that way. For the next few minutes, again, we probably will not get directly into the book itself this morning. There's just no way with the background material to cover. You can do that in the 30 minutes. But let's think about it for a moment. First thing to think about, the title and the contents. The book of Leviticus is a book you could truly say God breathed. In fact, look at what the Hebrews would use as a title would be the word in Hebrew that is translated, and the Lord called. The Lord called unto Moses. What's the opening of Leviticus? It's an extension of Exodus by the word and the Lord called. The Lord spoke. That happens, in fact, 18 chapters of the 27 that make up Leviticus begin with something of that phrase, and the Lord called, or the Lord said, this whole idea. 40 references of Leviticus in the New Testament ought to tell us that this book that God called out to Moses is also important in the New Testament. Then 40 times it's referenced. And so we see that picture. The book opens at the foot of Mount Sinai. The children of Israel are still there. They have come after the crossing of the Red Sea to Mount Sinai. They've set up a camp. Moses has gone up onto the mount. God has spent 40 days there with him. He's brought down the 10 Commandments. We know about some of those other things that happen in the book of Exodus. And so we see God now giving them during this time his instructions, his laws, as we would say, for orderly worship at the tabernacle. There's going to be things that God says you will do, things you will not do, and from those we can get great guidance. In fact, if we think about it, we see the picture of how God has begun to lay out things to man. In Genesis, one sees man falling into sin. In Exodus, man is redeemed. And in Leviticus, man is worshiping. Think about the Christian's life. The Christian falls into sin. The Christian is called out of sin. And the Christian ought to worship God. We see that same picture then here in the books. If we think about the first 5 books, to put Leviticus into a little broader picture as we begin it, the first 5 books of the Old Testament were called the books of the law. You have these books lay the foundation of, yes, the Judaistic law, but more importantly, the foundation for Christ. They reveal how God chose in Genesis a specific people. Think about that. Why does Genesis go to the trouble in Genesis 11 of saying, and Adam begat, and he 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 begat, over and over? It's to show us God's choice being made. How that there was going to be a nation set forth that would bring a promise and blessing on all the nations. In fact, just to give that idea, go to Genesis chapter 12 for a moment. Genesis 12. Verses 1 through 3, we think about the purpose of the Bible, and now the purpose of Genesis, laying the foundation for it to lead on. It says, now the Lord had said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. There is the picture then. God's making a choice of those that have fallen into sin. God sets forth a plan. In Exodus, we see God redeem the chosen people. What made them the choice? God did that literally. When we go to the New Testament, yes, it's a much broader choice. God puts forth the rules of how one can become a part of that people. But here you have those that have fallen being redeemed in Exodus. Once they're redeemed, they need to be sanctified, set apart, holiness. That's what Leviticus is about. And Leviticus naturally leads into the next book, Numbers, where they are guided. How did they get from one place to another? Now, everybody thinks about that pillar of fire and that cloud that guided them during the day, and there it is, physical leadership. But think about how one does spiritually with these things. Man has fallen into sin spiritually. Man can be redeemed. Are there physical acts associated with that? Absolutely. They're required under the obedience of God, just like thinking about that Passover lamb again for a moment as we put this whole perspective in. Any Israelite that didn't put that lamb's blood on the two doorposts and the lintel of the door, their firstborn died that night. It took a physical obedience for them to get out of a physical sin, but one that came because of the spiritual nature, God proving who God is. So you see that idea then guided in the book of Numbers and in the book of Deuteronomy, that people often get that confused thinking it's a second law. It's not really even a second law giving. It's a reminder. It's the instruction. You've had Genesis. You've had the laws that came in Exodus, the laws in Leviticus. We've had the events of Numbers. Now they're about to go into the nation, to take that nation that they will call Israel. God gives them instruction in. And so we see those first 5 books, and you see where Leviticus falls as the idea of setting them apart, how they are different from the world. Leviticus then also deals with the proper presentation of the sacrifices, the maintenance then of a clear distinction between that which is clean and that which is unclean. In fact, we'll find this in the New Testament where Jesus points out in some of his discussions, why are you bringing the halt, the lame, and the maimed to God? Don't bring the leftovers, bring the best. It's got to be a proper sacrifice. We think about that physical thing, and we'll look at that in the actual sacrifices when we start, that there is a proper way to present them. And think about that now. Is it possible for you to bring something that can be considered a sacrifice, but do it in a way in which is not acceptable? And we have that within this book. Chapter 10 is going to speak to that strange fire. You have 2 priests who came to do exactly what they were supposed to do, but somewhere in the mix, instead of going and getting the fire from the correct place, they brought a strange fire. They were doing exactly what they were supposed to do, but they weren't presenting it properly. And so we understand what Leviticus is about. God has a specific way he wants it done, and we need to do that. Leviticus then stands within that grouping we call the law as a law book for the Israelites. These laws, as it would be, emphasize Israel's worship to God and of God, and the instructions then where it gets its title for the priests. That the idea then that it's a book that deals with the Levites. In fact, that's what, when you take it to the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, the title given to the book was Leviticon, that meaning pertaining to the Levites. And it's fairly accurate. In fact, the Latin Vulgate brought forth the word Leviticus. And so when you read the book called Leviticus here and you say, there's a grand English word, you're not speaking English. That's Latin. We just took the Latin title and brought it on over to English. That's where the book of Leviticus gets its title now. It deals truly, though not entirely, with priestly matters. And the priests came from the tribe of Levi, so there we get the picture. But Leviticus is much more than just a manual for the priest. The work is quite concerned with the part the Israelite played. It's going to go into a definition. When you wanted to make a sacrifice, you didn't just call up the tabernacle and say, hey, I'd like to make a sacrifice today. And of course, one of the priests would take down your name and your contribution, because you called that 1-800 number and gave a contribution. And he would go out and select a proper sacrifice, or at least what he felt was for you. And they would take and kill it and burn it and say, you're all clear. That's not what happened. The Israelite had to go get the animal on his own, from his own stock or buying it from someone. You can see the idea of sacrifice. He had to bring that animal with him to the door of the courtyard where a priest would meet him. And at that point, the priest would take over doing the actual sacrificing. But that man or woman or child had to bring that sacrifice and had to see what happened to it. It wasn't just the priest. So we see the idea concerned with the part the Israelite played in their worship to God. In fact, many of the specifications in the book describe what the Israelite had to do to offer their worship to God. And so we begin to see the proper place of worship in the life of the Israelite. Then it goes on, yes, to what the priest had to do with it once it arrived. And so we see the idea that in the end, most of the ordinances, most of the law, the regulations in this book of Leviticus apply not just to the priesthood, but to the entire nation. The book also contains then 2 historical sections, which we'll look at closely when we get to them. Chapter 10, which contains the events surrounding the death of 2 priests by the name of Nadab and Abihu. And then in chapter 24, we find the incident of a blasphemer who was stoned. And so we'll look at those when we come to them. But one thing that ought to come clear to us as we look at Leviticus is that the sacrificial system was not the invention of the Hebrew people, either when Moses was alive or in any other time. There are people who want to say, oh, the Israelites just came up with that on their own. Look how much resemblance it has to what others were doing in the time. But think about this. There's a complete absence of the superstitious elements in the Israelite worship that characterized the worship of the idolatrous nations that surrounded Israel at that time. And so it was not something that the Hebrew people came up with, but that sacrificial system is a result of a direct revelation of God. This is God. This is what he wants. This is how you do it. And so then to just give you a short outline, as we're just about out of time this morning, the first series of laws and instructions is found in the first section of the book in chapters 1 through 16. This is the laws for God's people to be able to access the throne of grace, to be able to come before their God looking for forgiveness. The second series of laws is contained in the latter half of the book, chapters 17 through 27. Here is God setting forth the demands made by the holiness he has, so that his people might remain in fellowship with him and rejoice in his blessings. So one, to get past that sin, and one, to remain in that new place. So you have the 2 main sections of Leviticus in access to God, chapters 1 through 16, and sanctification, or the setting apart, the holiness of God's people, 17 through 27. 5 major sections, and this is what we'll close with this morning as we think about it. Chapters 1 through 7, offerings. That's going to cover the offerings that God expected to be made, those sacrifices. Chapters 8 through 10 are going to cover the consecration of the priest, how they're taken, consecrated, cleansed, and set apart for their duties. Chapters 11 through 15 talk about the holiness of not the priest, but the people. And so you see the idea there, how we're going to do that. And then you have the fourth section, atonement and righteousness, the price being paid, the righteousness that's expected, chapters 16 through 22. And in the fifth section, the various feasts of the Israelites. They're in chapters 23 through 27. And in fact, one of those has no food associated with the feast in and of itself. So consider the idea of what we think a feast really is. That's where we'll have to close this morning. Thank you.